She saved a future king from becoming a murderer, and the Bible barely gives her a headline. But that quiet sentence hides a night when pride almost pulled an entire household into slaughter, and one woman stepped into the road with bread, wine, and a spine of steel. The story sits in the ancient world of Israel's tribes, when the shepherd warrior David was not yet on a throne. He was running. King Saul wanted him dead, and David moved through the wilderness with hundreds of loyal fighters who lived by discipline, hunger, and the constant edge of violence. They were not a fantasy band of heroes. They were armed men in a hard landscape, and in that season they crossed paths with wealth that did not belong to them. The narrative places the episode after Samuel's death with David in the wilderness of Paran, then shifts the camera toward Carmel, near Mon, where a wealthy landowner's household is busy with sheep and shearing. Geography here is not tourism, it is pressure. Distance collapses when insult travels fast and armed men can close the gap between rumor and blood. In the region of Carmel, a man named Nabal owned large flocks and shearing crews. The text paints him as harsh and badly behaved, while his wife Abigail is described as intelligent and beautiful. That pairing already hums with tension because in the narrative world of 1 Samuel, character is not decoration, it is fate walking toward you in boots. David's men had been in the hills while Nabal's shepherds grazed sheep. According to the account, David's band had not robbed them. They had acted like a protective ring around the shepherds and the animals, turning away anyone who might have harmed them. It was a rough kind of neighborliness, the sort that expects reciprocity when the season turns. When shearing arrived, the celebration meant food, drink, and the temporary loosening of caution. David sent messengers with a courteous request, "Give what you can to my young men, because we come in peace on a feast day." The tone was formal, almost festive, as if David were inviting Nabal into a shared custom of hospitality. Nabal answered with contempt. He spoke as if he did not know David, as if the name meant nothing, as if generosity were weakness. He insulted the messengers and refused help. The text does not soften his words, it lets them land like stones. David's reaction surged hot and fast. He strapped on his sword and ordered his men to march. The narrative specifies that about 400 fighters went with him while 200 stayed with the baggage, a detail that quietly underscores how large a strike force was already in motion. He swore a severe oath, vowing that by morning he would leave no male belonging to Nabal alive. In that moment, the story tilts toward massacre. This is not a gentle misunderstanding. It is a leader about to turn protection into punishment on a massive scale. But that wasn't the real turning point. A servant ran to Abigail. The servant laid out the truth. David's men had been good to the shepherds, and Nabal had repaid kindness with abuse, and now a storm was coming that would erase the house. The servant even framed David as someone who fights the battles of the Lord, a line that shows how reputations travel in whispers ahead of armies. Abigail did not debate etiquette. She moved. She gathered bread by the hundreds, wine in skins, sheep already prepared, roasted grain, raisins, and pressed figs in quantities that read like a supply line built for an army, not a dinner party. The account lists the load with almost logistical precision, as if the storyteller wants you to feel the weight of what humility looks like when it is translated into sacks and animals. She sent servants ahead and rode down toward David herself, meeting him in a mountain pass before he reached the target of his anger. At the time, no one in Nabal's house could have guessed how narrow the window was between insult and blood. Picture the slope under moonlight or torchlight, the sound of packs and weapons, the moral certainty that feels like righteousness until it collides with a different kind of strength. David was moving with lethal intent, and the story wants you to feel the momentum. Because once a leader swears an oath in front of men who live by loyalty, turning back is not merely emotional. It is public. Meanwhile, in the house that caused the insult, music played and cups emptied. The contrast is almost unbearable. Celebration above, catastrophe approaching below, and information traveling faster through servants than through pride. At the time, no one realized how much hung on a single woman's decision to intercept shame with provision, to trade boasting for baskets, to meet fury with lowered posture and clear speech. And then something unexpected happened. Abigail did not arrive shouting. She got off her donkey, fell before David, and bowed to the ground. She asked him to listen. She spoke with clarity about his future, about God's purpose for him, about how unnecessary bloodshed would stain what was meant to be clean. She urged him not to take matters into his own hands in a way that would later haunt him, and she offered the gifts she brought. She even named her own husband's folly without pretending it was small, and she framed the moment as a rescue for David as much as for her household. Spare yourself from carrying needless guilt, she urged in the moral logic of the text. When Abigail speaks, she does not only apologize. She appeals to David's identity beyond this hot moment. She speaks of his life being bound securely in the bundle of the living, language the text preserves in her voice, and she asks that her gift be received and that blame fall on her. The scene is layered: diplomacy, theology, survival, and moral argument braided together without turning her into a lecture. David's rage broke. He blessed God for sending her to meet him that day. He praised her good judgment and promised that God would reward her. He spoke of her discernment as a gift that stopped him from blood guilt and from carrying a burden he would have regretted. He accepted the food. He sent her home in peace, telling her he had heard her and granted her request. The emotional temperature drops from white heat to something like relief. But the night is not over. David turned aside from the plan he had sworn. He let his men stand down. For a community that measured honor in steely consistency, that kind of reversal is a storytelling thunderclap, because it announces that wisdom can override momentum, even when momentum feels righteous. The caravan of food was not only charity, it was the tangible price of peace, and the narrative treats it seriously. Later tradition would remember David as a king and a poet, but here he is still a fugitive with a temper, and the text refuses to sand down the edges. That honesty is part of what makes Abigail's courage land. She intervenes not in a fairy tale, but in a world where insults can explode into bodies on the ground. What came next was even more significant for the household she returned to. When the account moves from the mountain pass back to Nabal's house, the pacing slows on purpose. You feel the hangover of celebration, the silence after noise, the way dread can arrive dressed as morning light. Abigail came back to a feast, still rolling in Nabal's house, music and drunkenness. The kind of celebration that blurs judgment. She waited until morning, when wine had loosened its grip. Then she told her husband what had happened, what she had done, what had almost arrived at their door. The narrative says Nabal's heart died within him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. The 10-day interval reads like a final breath held across the household, a stretch where consequences finish what confrontation started. The text does not pretend this is a tidy modern courtroom drama. It presents divine judgment in the language of its world, and it expects the listener to feel the weight of consequence without turning the story into a spectacle. Historians and scholars debate how ancient audiences heard that ending, but the narrative itself does not offer a footnote of doubt. It states the outcome plainly. But that wasn't the end. David heard that Nabal was dead, and he sent word to Abigail asking her to become his wife. She rose quickly, bowed with humility, and accepted. The story moves quickly to the next arrangements with brisk narrative economy. The text also notes David took Ahinoam of Jezreel, a reminder that royal life in this storyline is layered, complicated, and never reduced to a single romance. In the storyline of 1 Samuel, Abigail enters David's household as a woman whose courage had already been tested under extreme pressure. Her story continues inside a larger arc of exile, loyalty, and power shifting underfoot. She becomes part of David's life before the crown is secure, which means her bravery belongs to the chapter where survival is still an open question. If you enjoyed this deep dive into ancient narrative, like the video and subscribe for more weekly breakdowns. Across the centuries, readers have argued about motive, power, and gender, and honest reading leaves room for those debates. What remains stable in the text is the sequence: insult, threatened slaughter, interception, restraint, consequence, and a life redirected. Abigail's intervention is not a footnote. It is the hinge that keeps a night from becoming a massacre remembered for all the wrong reasons. The story keeps pulling you back because it refuses easy heroes. David is capable of noble song and terrible impulse. Nabal is wealthy and self-destructive. Abigail stands in the gap with speed, resources, and words, and the narrative grants her that space without turning her into a symbol stripped of human pressure. Years later, when people retell Israel's story, they often reach for thrones and battles. This episode asks you to notice the road, the loaded animals, the breath before swords leave their sheaths. It asks you to feel how close history comes to splitting on a single decision, and how sometimes the decisive act is not a charge but a plea spoken well at the right moment before the fire spreads. The account in 1 Samuel does not specify the hour or the exact look of the pass. It keeps the scene spare, which forces the listener to fill the silence with imagination, and that spareness is part of the dread. What the text does supply is motive stacked on motive, pride against hunger, protection against insult, and a woman who chose interception over denial. 2 Samuel later names a son born to David and Abigail, a small genealogical anchor that ties her into the political genealogy of the kingdom, though the primary drama of her life remains fixed to that night on the road. What happened next changed everything for everyone who heard the tale in its own time. The memory of a night that almost went wrong and a woman who made sure it did not. Abigail didn't just save her household, she saved a future king from his own shadow. In a world of pride and fury, she chose the path of peace and changed the course of history. A reminder that one voice can still silence a storm.